So I spent my life in various legal issues and interpreting the law. Because when the law is complicated, no one understands it. And it means that the people with power make things complicated, and the people who need to be protected by the law are not protected. So it means that the power lies with those with money and those with power.
Going back to what you were saying before about the relationship between stories, narrative and law, you'll see that some of the most effective campaigns, you mentioned political campaigns, are where there's been some kind of tragedy.
Don't we forget that though? We don't think of it as a legal document to govern our everyday lives, and it's because sometimes we see it as archaic and forget that these laws can be relevant today.
The Manna Journey is the catalyst for change in our world. It's a consistent source of truth for the next generation and current leaders. Our mission is to change the world by reframing our current governance, by using ancient wisdom to solve modern problems, and by shaping innovative new businesses to have a culture of pursuit of purpose.
Is the law working for modern society, and is the Bible the place to look for how we can redesign our legal system? Well, Philip Ullman thinks we can learn from the Bible, and this is part of the Manna Journey, a series that looks at how we can bring more Bible study and more understanding into our modern everyday life. I'm joined, of course, by Philip Ullman, but also by Harvey Bolofsky, who is the Emeritus Rabbi of the Golders Green Synagogue. Harvey, welcome. Philip, welcome. So, Philip, what is the problem with our current legal system?
For a start, it's far too complicated. So I spent my life in various legal issues and interpreting the law, and employing lots of people who are to an extent vulnerable, because when the law is complicated, no one understands it, and it means that the people with power can make things complicated and do make things complicated, and the people who need to be protected by the law are not protected. So the complication just means that the power lies with those with money and those with power.
Yeah, I suppose it just restricts access, doesn't it? If you've got a law that's very simple to understand, anybody can read it. Whereas if you need lawyers to do absolutely everything, then those people who can afford the lawyers are good, and those people who can't afford the lawyers are in a bad place.
Yeah, take, for example, the sub-post office issue that's around. Was using cases, barristers against poor, vulnerable operators of sub-post office, and they couldn't protect themselves. And the problem, as I understand it, was a technological problem, but that was swept under the carpet, and the law was used against people that can't protect themselves. I've seen it time and time again. Workers in companies can be dismissed in breach of law, unfair dismissal, unlawful dismissal, but they simply can't protect themselves because the law is too complicated and they haven't got the money. So in order to protect the most vulnerable in society, you have to have a legal system which is simple.
But there's an argument that goes the other way though, isn't it? If the law is very, very prescriptive, then people understand it. It might make it much longer, but actually it makes it easier to understand. But you don't buy that, do you?
No, the size of the European Constitution is big, and how can anybody understand it? I was involved in an event in Parliament not long ago where they were debating a piece of legislation was coming to the Parliament. There were 700 amendments being made by the government on the last day without time to debate. That isn't democracy. That's not protecting people from, it's actually the bureaucracy creating a life of its own and more or less doing what it wants, even to the point where many MPs, I'm told, vote because they're told by text what to vote. Yeah. Because they don't understand the legislation either. So it's.
I've got to be honest with you. When I worked in the House of Commons, what would happen is the MPs would be sitting round, just as we're sitting round here. The bell would go. That's the division bell, which most people know about. They'd have to go and vote, and they'd just literally take the phone out the pocket, and it would say vote yes or vote no. They didn't even know what they were voting on. But even if they had the time to scrutinise it, it's so long it would be incomprehensible anyway.
I think there's a difference between something which is long and detailed and complicated. Means that if there are a set of simple, easily comprehensible principles, life is complicated, people are complicated, and there will be a lot of details. Yep. The problem is that it's confusing and contradictory and not based on a set of values. Yep. And so we can make a distinction between the two. So when a legal system has clear, accessible, easily explicated principles, then inevitably there are lots of details of life. There will be quite a lot of details, but they'll be easy to understand and even generate yourself. My teacher, Rabbi Sachs, once said that when legal systems are excessively complicated, they fall apart because it's not possible for them to operate. They don't serve the people for which they're really designed. And then it slips into what Philip said, which is that you end up in a situation where only the people who have devised them, sometimes deliberately, are able to control them, and this disadvantages ordinary people.
But it becomes very, very difficult, doesn't it, Harvey, when you're in a position whereby things are no longer intuitive. So you talked about principles behind things. I mean, that's easy. I mean, quite often with a lot of very historic law in this country, you would be able to guess basically what is legal and what is illegal. But now things are much more complicated. Those principles that sit behind it somehow seem to have disappeared.
I think that's right. And using an analogy to judicial law is very, 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 very detailed. And the Jewish sources understand that's because people are complicated. But there are simple principles, and if you knew them and understood them, you'd be able to work out in most cases fairly intuitively what you can and can't do.
I think it's important to remember, Harvey and I have been studying together for about 3 or 4 years, and what we discovered between us not long ago was the key function now of storytelling in making the law simple. It's not something that we ever were taught as we grew up, or it wasn't part of our education. We were taught the stories of the Bible, and we're taught the law, but we never really were taught to connect the two.
But there's a number of different things that you might call the law, isn't there? Because if you think about it, we've got the British legal system, if you like, but also there are things like the laws of fair play, those kind of things that you're brought up with, the sort of religious law as well. And actually, in a sense, I find it easier to understand those laws that my mum and dad taught me that might not be in legislation than I do with the actual body of law that's come from the country.
What we realised is that storytelling is actually intuitive. It's vital. We all tell stories. It explains who we are. It explains our background, our history. Jonathan Sachs talks a lot about the Americans and edition. I forget. He talks about the words on is it the Statue of Liberty? There's a lot of stories. Whereas in the UK, we tend not always to have the same lengthy stories.
Yeah, it also avoids the idea that the rules are arbitrary.
Yeah.
For example, sports have to have rules. When you play football, you have to all agree the rules, but those rules aren't based on any particular values. There's a set of rules that are developed that make the game work, but they are quite arbitrary. No reasonable person could guess them. They've been devised to enable the sport to function properly. As long as all the people play by the sport, it works. The other end is that you need to have rules which speak to people, and they relate to their experience. What Philip said about the relationship between narrative and law is really fascinating. It's quite right. We learn by reading the Bible. There are stories, some of them are very famous. There are laws about how to run a society, about rituals, and about economics and how to run a society and its monetary functions. But there isn't an obvious connection, and certainly we learned to understand them as the Word of God, a communication of the divine, equally important, but without a very clear understanding of what the relationship is between them. What we have discovered, pointed out by colleagues through our own investigation and by studying the works of some contemporary authors, is there is a sophisticated way and really very intuitive to understand the relationship between narrative and law. Stories speak to people, they relate to their common experience, it's easy to evoke emotions, and it creates a much wholer sense of who we are, what we need as individuals, and how to make a society. A lot of these stories are about when things go terribly wrong. We can look at the story of the Israelites in Egypt just as one example, and you can see what happens when people are mistreated, when there's a scarcity of resources, and that is exploited by people in charge. And what the law does that follows is help people to create a society that does not replicate those, that addresses those and trains people to live in an equitable fashion. And that extraordinary synergy between narrative and law is what is really new and exciting for both of us.
Just park that for a second. But one thing that really interests me is it your view that the need for the narrative within the Bible is to make it universal? Because look, inevitably, as a rabbi, you're an academic in your field. You've got knowledge of theology. But most people don't have that. And to make the Bible universal, is it important to have had that narrative within it?
I think the narrative is very important, and one of the reasons the story begins, even though it's the 5 books of Moses are ostensibly about the experience of the Jewish people, but nonetheless, it starts the 60-odd chapters of universal history about the beginning of humanity and about the flood and about a world which is really kind of pre-Jewish people, and that's to universalize the experience. It's very interesting that you see those stories are essential, and that establishes who's in charge, that God brings the world into being, that he's in charge of the resources and therefore can allocate them and demand they're used in a particular way. And those stories are very much the story of human beings. We might read about individuals, about Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, but we are also taught to understand that these people are us. And these experiences are universal, and therefore the rules that follow address issues that are not just rooted in a particular society, but will be part of the human experience, and if not addressed, those inequities and wrongs will keep repeating throughout society.
Philip, but I'll tell you, Philip, when I grew up, and this is a mistake, I think, when I grew up, these were almost stories of almost mythical people with no modern relevance. And what I always did was, you do your work all week, and for you on the Saturday, for me on the Sunday, that's when you do a bit of engagement with the Bible, but spend the rest of the week not really thinking about it. And that I think, on reflection, that was silly.
And what we also find in our circles is often the fathers are depicted as saints. There's a danger of saying these are our forefathers; they can't make mistakes, and therefore we interpret the text in such a way as to almost paint them as people that are perfect. But I don't think that is the way it actually pans out, because if you're teaching lessons, you want to say something, Harvey?
I do.
Okay, please, over to you.
So I would say that one needs to be quite cautious with this approach. This conversation is actually a major unresolved disagreement in traditional Jewish sources. Many Jewish sources really do want to paint the figures in Genesis, notwithstanding many of their obvious shortcomings, the saintly figures, Beowulf type characters, where they can do no wrong, and when things appear to be wrong, they are interpreted to be, well, they're really doing the right thing, it's just you don't quite understand. Other sources, very traditional, reliable sources, take a different approach. There is a particular 13th century source which is known as very reliable, Rabbi Moses, son of Nachmanides, as he's known to the academic world. He takes the view that the ancestors do make mistakes, and these stories are to teach us about human shortcomings and to learn from them, but they are not saintly figures in that they cannot commit any kind of wrongdoing. They're not infallible.
I hear that.
No, my question to both of you, though, is, does it matter? Because if these are important figures, important historical figures, important religious figures, but at the same time, if these stories are there to illustrate how we should live our lives, then the fact that these people have shortcomings or don't have shortcomings, in a sense, doesn't make much difference, does it?
No, it makes it more realistic, because we all live in a world where lots of us have shortcomings.
So I think it does make a difference. I think what Philip said, it does make a difference. To read them as inerrant or infallible makes them much less accessible and real to ordinary people. All of us are fallible. And so while one needs to acknowledge there are two streams of thinking in traditional sources, the one which suggests they can make mistakes and we learn, and we can learn from them, makes them more accessible and real to us and appeals to me.
But especially if you're looking at the law and narrative being linked, you need to work out why was the law needed. You need to know what went wrong with society without that set of laws. And if nothing went wrong because they were all perfect, there's no problem to resolve. But it's also unique, as far as I'm aware, where you've got a legal constitution which includes the narrative, the stories, that actually paints an emotional picture of of God and how He wants the world to operate, of people and how we should behave. It's stories of good emotions and identifying with the characters, and I think they're much better in terms of identifying meaning. Because when I was involved in the legal cases, the story behind the legislation is not included in the actual legislation. You just have a very simple line at the beginning which doesn't say what it's about. The story which happens, which is part of Hansard, which is a record of what happens in Parliament, is not accessible. It's not to be quoted within the legal system, which means you're actually actively separating the law from the true purpose of that law. And the Bible doesn't want to do that. That's why you get much more meaningful. You can almost see what kind of society the Bible is trying to paint a picture of.
Yeah, of course, Philip. The funny thing is about that, there's no reason why that needs to be the case, is there? Because actually you could, and people do it all the time in terms of political campaigning, say, we want this law for this reason. You know, somebody was murdered, somebody was run over, or there was some fraud committed. You could literally put, this is what was said in Parliament and this is why we passed the law. But we haven't done that. And actually that does make legal cases harder.
No question. And what it does is it gives power to the judges, because they're not bound by what actually happened. There was a case where I was dealing with paying the minimum wage when people were asleep. And if you looked at Hansard, it was crystal clear in the debates and the consultation, they did not want to pay when a person was asleep, because you're not really working when you're asleep, even though
a care worker.
A care worker who's sleeping. So when they're working, the way we used to do it in my organisations, when it was a sleeping night, i.e. if they woke up for a couple of hours, you'd pay them for the full night. Otherwise, you'd pay them allowance, which was the minimum wage. It was at £25 for a night, for example, and it worked. But then, and that was actually debated in Parliament in the consultation, and they said, no, we don't want to pay because you're not working when you're asleep. Then it appears in front of the judges. In fact, it was Lord Neuberger in the Court of Appeal who thought about the fact that, 1 minute, if you're at a care home, you can't leave. So to an extent, you may not be working, but you're restricted in terms of what you could do. So they decided that they should pay even when you're asleep. But that wasn't in intention. So the legislation didn't actually deal with it. So you get judicial legislation where the judges start to make it all up, and you get 10 or 15 years of law which is actually based on a flaw in the law which had...
Does that mean that by divorcing narrative from, if you like, the prescriptive element of the legislation, that actually that in of itself risks morality disappearing and not being embedded within?
I think if we think from a kind of idealistic perspective, we want to resolve conflicts, which is what the law is about, in the most loving, caring, peaceful way. And as far as I can see, the way it seems to work is we do it in the same way as organisations that are looking to work in a much more conscious level. What they do when they're resolving conflict is the two people involved in the conflict, one of them will make a request of the other. But the key thing is that they will not be judgmental. They won't judge the other person, and two, they won't force their views onto the other. And then the way these organisations all seem to work is that you then are trying to make peace between those two people. And then you get a third, if they can't make peace between themselves, rather than escalating it to a judge, to actually determine externally what they do. You get.
But it sounds like what you're saying is that if you simplify the law, it makes mediation much more simple to do, much more possible. And so actually, ironically, it de-stresses and de-escalates.
Absolutely. The law, which is appealed level after level, is escalating the problem, and more people get involved, and it can result in wars and things like that.
I think we've all experienced a circumstance where we've had a falling out with somebody, perhaps some legal dispute, where you end up, if you write the letter, you add more and more grievances in there, because obviously in court it's a case of a binary thing. Somebody wins and somebody loses.
And it also becomes less accessible to ordinary people because those things incur greater and greater costs. Yes. And therefore, the more complicated it gets, the more stages there are, the fewer people can afford to see it through. Right, yeah. Because the consequences are ruinous if it goes wrong. Going back to what you were saying before about the relationship between stories, narrative and law, you'll see that some of the most effective campaigns, you mentioned political campaigns, are where there's been some kind of tragedy. something horrible's happened to a child, something dreadful's happened, and they name it and they say it's so-and-so's law. Sarah's law is the most obvious example where something horrible happened, and people can relate to it, and now they understand this was a horrible thing, and we need to have legislation to minimise the possibility of this recurring, and so on and so forth, or to promote a particular way of thinking. The ethic which emerges from the story is embedded in the law, and there's a direct route between them. And I think that this is the kind of thing we are seeing in our studies.
But that route ceases to exist when the legislation is put onto the statute book, which I suppose is odd, really.
And what Harvey and I realised was that back and when the Bible was written, it wasn't read. The paper wasn't there. There was an element of parchment and the stone version, get the way it's described, but there wasn't the ability to print loads and loads of copies of it. Therefore, it had to be listened. It was phonetic.
And people couldn't read it even.
No, they couldn't. Effectively, it had to be simple. It had to be understood by hearing, and therefore stories are brilliant for that because it's easy to remember. They're simple, and therefore we have to look at it as simply as we can.
But to kick back for both of you, isn't there an argument that says that the weakness of this is that the stories effectively infantilise the whole thing? Because I remember when I was in primary school, I mean, I heard about bread of heaven, and I was thinking of loaves flying from the sky. Right. You know, it does.
So there is always a risk that if one reads stories in a simplistic way, that one will end up with a childlike understanding even when one's an adult. There's actually quite well-known medieval Jewish sources, the genre of Jewish literature called midrash, which is really a sophisticated way of understanding the text. Interpretation should not be studied by children, because the consequence is you'll end up with a childlike understanding which you'll then take forward into adulthood. And these are intended to be sophisticated ideas which convey profound ethical underpinnings in the story, fill in the lacuna, the spaces in the text, in ways that enable us to understand what's really going on. Very often, the most important things you can learn is from what's not said, and that requires... This is not kind of what we're doing here, but certainly Jewish commentators and those who have the privilege to engage in this activity will be able to understand the stories at a sophisticated level, how they were intended. I'm sure there are much more sophisticated ways of understanding them too. So yes, stories are clever because a child can remember them and communicate them and still remember things. We still remember stories we were told when we were children. But what you then have to do is advance your understanding and realise the story is a vehicle to understand concepts which, once you become able to abstract, are then able to access.
One other question on all of that is the Bible itself has quite an odd structure, and obviously it is. I don't know if you'd describe it as a legal, moral, or theological document, or all of those together. But I guess it'd just be helpful just to explain why you think perhaps that's the case.
So, on the surface, you're quite right. We have a long section of narrative starting with creation and going through the flood, and then the founding patriarchs and matriarchs of the Israelites, and eventually and so on until you get to the law, which is already 70 chapters into this quite long book, and then it flits backwards and forwards between narrative and law, right into the end of Deuteronomy, and it is an odd structure. On the other hand, if the goal is to communicate not just a history of a people, not just the legal system of the people, but about a relationship between God and a people, right, which is simultaneously experienced through stories, history, experience, and then also through divine communication, which enables us to learn from those experiences and create a just society based on what we've learned from it, then it suddenly starts to slot into place.
But to me, it's not the theology that matters. It's the universal vision of a society where we care for each other, we care for the planet, and it's designed with a very simple vision and narrative combined with law that can be applied by anybody to create a society where everybody's looked after, which is not the kind of society we currently have.
Philip, don't we forget that though? we don't think of it as a legal document to govern our everyday lives. Oh, okay, some people do, and present companies probably accept it, but many of us do not. And it's because sometimes we see it as archaic and forget that these laws can be relevant today.